All right, so now we find ourselves in section 2 of chapter 5. So this is the history of Southeast Asia. And just always when we cover section 2, there's a lot of stuff packed in here. So we'll try to go fairly quickly. I mean, people have lived in this region for a long period of time, thousands of years. But we're going to kind of focus on some of the really big highlights in this region. Can kind of skip past that. So this is kind of important. One of the earliest civilizations that lived there built these kind of famous temples. Well, this slide actually deals with that. I don't think it actually does state that on there. I think that's what this is what I can't remember some of the pictures that look very similar, but there's a kingdom that built these temples, and it's called Angkor Wat, and that may show up a little bit later on. That's kind of these famous temples. Kind of known around the world. But one thing we talked about in the first section is just that there's a lot of access to the water, and by them being islands, part of it being on a peninsula. So Southeast Asia is often called the crossroads of the world because of these trade routes that exist here. Now some of them do go across land, obviously the red ones here, but then obviously you can get somewhere quicker by water. So that's always been important to the history, and things like spices that existed that were in Asia that Europe wanted. So that was really important. So let's see, going down here, some just different kingdoms that were talked about that occupied these spaces. Obviously, if you need to be filling in the notes from the note sheets, they should be a little bit briefer this time, so be filling those in. We talked about in the first section the Strait of Malacca. And so kingdoms controlled that area because it was a major trade route. That's modern day Singapore. Here is what I was talking about. In Cambodia, the Khmer Empire built these temples, a major architectural feat. There's one called Angkor Wat and one called Angkor Thom. So they are these kind of like cone-shaped towers that many people come and visit because they're old, and this is a video I think that talks about those there. So Islam kind of moved into the region, and I don't think this slideshow talks about that, but like today, Indonesia, I believe, is the largest Islamic country in the world. Partly because Indonesia is one of the biggest countries in the world, but you probably think of, at least I do, East Asia, I think of more Buddhism, other religions that are practiced there. But Indonesia has a large portion of Islamic people, Muslims, because they controlled parts of this area. They brought certain things through trade into this region. And then they established ports in the 1400s. So it says by the 1600s, Islam was the dominant religion across the Malay archipelago. And like I said, I think Indonesia is the largest Islamic country in the world today. All right, what else do we got here? Spices, we already kind of talked about that, and that would kind of increase important trade. There's even a select section of islands called the Spice Islands in this area because of that. There's also other resources, things like gold and silver. The Portuguese and the Spanish were both kind of competing for territory here. The Portuguese actually conquer Malacca and control it for a while. And then you can see kind of things that are produced here. So we got black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, coriander, ginger, nutmeg, and vanilla. It's kind of like our Christmas spices, if you think about it. Cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg like all go into like pumpkin pie. And ginger, like in gingerbread. So it's very kind of like Christmassy kind of spices. That's what they were trying to get from these Southeast Asian countries. You can kind of see on the map where some of them come from, kind of a collection across there. So Ferdinand Magellan shows up in this section, and he was a Spaniard, and he led exploration into this region, and he reached the Philippines, and he set it up as a Spanish colony. And so kind of interesting, and I think he actually ended up dying there. He was killed by the natives in that area. It doesn't talk about that, I don't think, on this slide, but I think that's supposed to be him fighting against the natives of the Philippines. And even to this day, that Spanish heritage is pretty common. Kind of side story here for you. Many of you may know Mrs. RG, Mrs. Rivera Gill. So her maiden name is Rivera because her dad is from the Philippines. But if you hear the name Rivera, that does not sound Asian, right? It sounds kind of like it would be Hispanic because that would be a Spanish last name. So even Mrs. RG's own heritage kind of is connected to the Philippines and the Spanish influence that exists there. A lot of areas in the world we talk about will get colonized. We talked about in the first section Burma, which is now Myanmar. They became colonies of Great Britain. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia became colonies of France. So just lots of control. A lot of these places were after cash crops. So they were growing things like tea, coffee, and tobacco so they could sell those and trade them. Thailand, which was also known as Siam. We have a Thai restaurant in Bloomington called the Siam House, so that's where that name comes from. It was the only one to not be colonized by Europeans, and it had an absolute monarchy, which is one where the monarch is the one ruler governing the whole country, and they were able to remain independent. So it's kind of interesting. Let's see. Some of the colonists ruled kind of harshly. Many of them didn't really gain their freedom until after World War II ended. Philippines was the first to gain independence. The United States controlled the colony in 1898 after defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War. And then we turned control back over. And this is during World War II, Japan sent in military forces to take control of Southeast Asia. And then Japan ruled it for several years and brought the people under great hardship. But then when Japan surrenders in the war, the United States granted independence to the Philippines instead of controlling that directly. And then it talks about kind of the history of the other countries here gaining independence. There's this trend in social studies that we'll study this year is like one country gets independence, it kind of inspires another country to get independence and another one and another one. That same trend is very evident in kind of African history as well. So they get independence, and then this kind of brings us into the section about the Vietnam War. So in Vietnam, communist forces defeated the French and ruled the northern part of the country. The United States supported leaders in the South against communists. And I don't know if he's talked about in this section, the leader of the communists was named Ho Chi Minh. And that was actually what their capital was known as, called Ho Chi Minh City. So the fighting was fought in Vietnam, kind of between North and South Vietnam, but really South Vietnam was being involved, and it was an 8-year war, and the war ended without the U.S. winning. It's one of the few wars in United States history that the U.S. has not won. It was kind of just a stalemate. Like we didn't surrender and lose the war, but by not really winning the war, we kind of lost the war and we left. And then North Vietnam took back over South Vietnam and kind of unified the country under communists. So this is Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communists, and kind of an important part of the history of Vietnam. In Laos, Vietnam communists fought the government, which collapsed in 1975. And so there's just kind of lots of war that existed. Cambodia is kind of known for this group called the Khmer Rouge. And they were this brutal group that took over. And underneath them, there was this mass genocide. 1.5 million people died. Really, really bad. And then in 1978, Vietnam sent soldiers to invade Cambodia and set up a new government that it controlled. This began the civil war that lasted almost 13 years. So there's just been lots of conflict and fighting in this region of the world. Economic growth in China and Taiwan has helped some countries in Southeast Asia. Singapore is one of the world's wealthiest countries. I actually looked this up. So their GDP is not the highest. Indonesia is, because it's just such a big country. But if you break it down by GDP per capita per person, then Singapore is significantly higher, like double in the amount that the other countries are. Thailand is still a constitutional monarchy. I had a friend that actually went to Thailand, and it was his birthday, and there's like this huge celebration throughout the country. And he died a few years later, the monarch, because he was like his 100th birthday or something. He was very, very old at the time. I don't think that's a picture of him there. It could be. And then Myanmar has struggled to maintain its independence. Just lots of conflict in the world. So lots of fighting is kind of a bigger theme, and then just kind of knowing this kind of idea of communism that kind of took United States brought us into the Vietnam War, and just the outcome of that was that we didn't win it. Those are kind of major things. Angkor Wat, that area in Cambodia, is a major kind of well-known structure there. Those are key things to know, and just the kind of the whole islands and peninsulas and having access to water are also major themes in this section. So that is a little bit about the history